Let me start with a little bit about why the heck I'm structuring this class in relation to the Declaration of Independence. Jefferson, as well as pretty much all of the founding fathers, was deeply immersed in the classics to the extent to where there are several articles and even books that address that fact. And noticing that his knowledge of Latin is very conspicuously reflected in the words that he chooses so carefully in such an important document for our nation. It was a matter of noticing that the roots that emerged over the course of these words being presented the way they were in that particular order was a good way for us to point out how important it is to learn about what these words mean and how they mean what they mean. The roots that are represented in the Declaration of Independence uncannily introduce to you roots that we would be learning in this class anyway. So I figure what better way to structure the class than to actually do it in connection with such an important document. Now, another reason for doing it, even if that weren't the case, is, my gosh, there isn't a more important document for us to be able, at the end of the semester, to look back at and to notice how much more depth it has for you, for us, when we read it, after having gone through what we will have gone through by the end of the semester, and going so deeply into these various roots and learning many of the important words that are derived from these roots. There's just something to that. There's almost a magic to that in my eyes. It just makes the document that much more profound. It helps you appreciate what a wordsmith Jefferson was, more so than if you hadn't gone through that process. I think that it'll continue to be an interesting and fruitful way to proceed, so we'll keep doing that. All right, that being said, let's jump to the next one. The next root, as you might have guessed if you're noticing a pattern here, is pop. In Latin, populus is a noun that literally means the people, okay? And it's pretty much its own root. You can't trace it back to anything more primitive than that. It literally means the people. Now, it's important to know, in order to understand the offshoots of this root in English, that when you start seeing this word being used in Rome, it is always in contrast with the opposite of the people, which is those in power. Okay, so we're talking about a society, at first especially when you have kings ruling Rome, where, believe it or not, the king was not considered to be one of the people. Okay, it was that strictly demarcated between those in power and those not in power. The people were, at first, completely without power. There was no law code, no say in governing in Rome at first, and it was nothing but the king and his retainers and everybody else. As time went on, the people gained more and more power. When you talk about people, you're talking about the category of people, whereas populace is more along the lines of the people as opposed to those who are in power, just like populus. So populace is as close as we can get in English to populus in Latin, whereas people is more a kind of taxonomic term that differentiates people from dogs, for example. Populate means to make people, or if we wish, to make it into a verb, to people, to people a certain area, or to make people in a certain area. That means, that's what populate means. In the ancient world, you had Greece, the various Greek city-states, populating various islands and other parts of the Greek mainland in order to create different communities that would grow up and eventually somewhat unify, and not officially until the 1800s of our era, but pretty close to it. And so population, again, pat yourself on the back for being able to guess what that means. The ION is state of, or being. So the being, making of people. Okay, being, making people is being, or state of, ate, and then pope. And now notice, you guys, that quite often what will happen is we have an ATE suffix, but we're cutting off the E when it's followed by another suffix. Quite often that happens. So here you might as well have the E before the I, but that's weird, right? You never see that. So that's why the E is cut off. It would be superfluous as far as the vowels go, so you don't need that E. But if I were to ask you the elements of the word population, I would ask you root, suffix, and suffix. Okay? And you would tell me pop, ate, and ion. Okay? Now, if you ever say T-I-O-N, and there's a T-I-O-N word, you won't get that wrong, because it's either T-I-O-N or I-O-N, either way. Means state of or being. Okay, so to populate a place, and then population is the state of doing that. All right, now we get into some fun stuff. There's some really interesting things going on. So look for some really nice overlapping of ancient and modern ideas in these next few roots that we're looking at. So popular, when you talk about popular things, again, the AR is nothing but a linguistic ending. In Latin, it would be ARIS, so the IS is dropped off, but it's another state of thing. So when things are popular, it means having to do with the people. And so the idea of popular culture, or pop culture, which we're going to get to in a second, comes from the idea of a differentiation between what was originally considered to be culture, which is literature, poetry, music, and things like that. And then as time goes on and people become, get more of a voice in society, there's this differentiation between what was originally called culture, kind of the more highbrow notion of culture, and then ideas of the people having their own culture, the popularis, the populares, the regular people, the ordinary people. Now in the US, as you probably know somehow, it wasn't really until the 50s that this idea of pop culture, as you guys call it, and this is your invention, your generation, a thing, all right? Pop culture didn't become a thing until really the 50s, and why would that be, you guys? Any ideas? Why did it all of a sudden after World War II become a thing? Anybody know? It all has to do with mass media. It has to do with TV more than anything else, but also radio, movies, okay, but especially TV, mass media. The idea of disseminating all these different ideas, the Beatles on Ed Sullivan's show, and then Elvis and this and that. So TV played the biggest role in disseminating this idea of pop culture as well as the reality of it, okay? And then to popularize something, to make it more, not necessarily palatable, it doesn't have to be something boring or anything, but to make it more understandable, comprehensible to the people is what popularizing means. Now we get to something a little more complex and in some ways more interesting, this idea of solv or solut. Now the reason why we have those two ostensibly, which means kind of on the surface at first, apparently, different forms for this root, and this is a really important concept to get, and you're going to see it throughout the semester, is that in Latin, when a root comes from a Latin verb, because, as we looked at the beginning of the semester, Latin verbs have those different, what are called principal parts. I showed you the different forms that cover all of the possible permutations of a given verb. Because of that, quite often in English, the derivations into English from Latin and from Greek, but especially from Latin, will come from an alternate form of the original one. So with pop, because it's a noun, you just pretty much have populus, okay? It turns into populi, populo, populum, populo. You keep pop throughout. But with solvo in Latin, then you have that alternate form, solut, which means having been loosened. So you have the active and the passive. So quite often English words come from the passive form. You have that boulder in the middle of the road, which is kind of in the way, okay? It's thrown forward in your way, and it becomes a problem that needs to be solved, right? And I'm using that metaphorically here. Well, that comes from the verb in Greek, proballo, which means to throw forward. Okay, so a problem comes from that verb. Problem means something thrown at you, thrown forward at you, that gets in your way, that you have to what? Solve. You have to loosen up, get out of the way, okay? And so look at some interesting permutations of this root. Okay, a solution. The first thing we think of is maybe a math problem, x plus 1 equals 3, so x equals 2, that kind of solution, because the problem is x, and you want to solve it. You want to loosen it up so it no longer exists and it becomes a 2 instead of an x. That would be one kind of solution we might think of. And then you have the boulder in the road as another one. But then what about a liquid solution? What's going on there? Well, okay, what that says is solute. That's the thing that you put. So let's read that. A liquid mixture in which a minor component, the solute, is uniformly distributed within the major component, the solvent. Okay, so you have the solvent in the glass, and you have the solute, which is salt in this case. And you pour it in, and the idea is the salt is distributed equally throughout. So what's the idea? So it's loosened up. The salt is loosened up to where it's not just in one place concentrated, but rather all over the place. So that's why it's called a solution. And as you know, because you know suffixes, and I told you had to know them, and we had to spend all that time on them, you know how to turn solve into solution. You have the solute root, and then you have the ion, which means the state of, or being. So you have the solvent, and the solvent is as it says there, liquid mixture, and then it's the solvent that is the major component of a solution. Whenever you bring a verb, say from Latin, we'll stick with Latin right now. Whenever you bring a verb form from Latin into English, it may very well originally in Latin be an active verb form, or it may be a passive verb form. But once it's brought into English, goodbye grammar. So there's no reason. Think of it this way, you guys. It's all about setting up the possibility for expanding the horizons of the root. Think of it that way. You bring a passive form into English, and you can bet that most likely that passivity of that form is going to disappear. And then it's active just like all the others. And it's just nothing but a way to increase the possibilities of different words that you can build from that same root. Then we get to a very similar idea to solving, is resolving, but with the added emphasis on going back from something that's in the way. Okay, so you know, if you think of the boulder in the road as a problem, you can resolve that problem by pushing it away. That would be pushing it away. So that's resolving. So to resolve something is just like solve. It just means to loosen back. Okay, and that's what's going on with that guy intermediating in the middle between those two who are wanting to fight. Resolving the situation is loosening them back in a metaphorical sense. Okay, they want to fight, but he's pushing them away. Okay, and then there's resolve. This is something, I don't use this or anything, but I just found it on Google Image. The idea here is that you have, it says spot and stain, so you have stains on clothes. So what do you want to do? You want to get rid of those stains. You want to loosen them away. You want to resolve them, right? And so you want to, and that's kind of an interesting name for that product because it kind of requires a knowledge of etymology, doesn't it? I bet you a lot of people looking at it, what is it called? Resolve. That's weird. Resolve my problem? Well, that's a little erudite, all right? But what it's pointing to is that it's pushing away the stains from the clothes or the spot from the clothes, okay? Now, as you know, resolution, state of that, the state of resolving, okay? The state of resolving something would be resolution. Now, this is where it gets fun. So if you resolve to do something, what do you do? How the heck is choosing yes or no resolving the situation? Resolve. If you think of those two things, what you're doing is you're loosening the no away from the yes. Just like loosening the spot away from the clothes is the idea. Okay? Now notice that etymologically, there's a lot of metaphor going on. A lot of metaphorical stuff. No, obviously, you're not literally taking a yes from a no. It's not yes, no, and then you're pulling them apart, but you get the idea. You're separating the one from the other and you're committing, sending yourself together. That's what that means. We'll get mit later. Sending yourself together with that decision. You're saying yes rather than no. You're separating no away from the yes the way you separate the stain from the clothes. And then if you have New Year's resolution, a very common use of resolution, what does that mean? It means to resolve on one thing or over another. All right, now this is really interesting. Okay, and then I'm not picking on the U.S., by the way. This is not a political statement. All right, yeah, although we are giantly in debt, let's face it. But anyway, okay. But it's just too beautiful a metaphor for us not to use. Pretend it's any country, whatever. That's not the point. The point is being chained to debt. What does it mean to be insolvent? Okay, we know that the ent, just like ents, just like ants, etc., means being or state of. State of what? State of not, because this is the N that means not. Okay, it doesn't mean in, and it doesn't mean into, and it doesn't mean inside of. It means not. Being not loose. Okay, what does it mean? It means you're chained down to your debt, and you can't loosen yourself from your debt. Okay? I don't know if many people know that. You know, when people say they're insolvent, they usually think that means I don't have any dough. Okay, but it specifically means not able to pay off your debts. Like it says there are persons or businesses that are incapable of paying their debts as they fall due. Okay? Interesting, right? Okay? Teach that to one of your parents tonight. That's a good one. Insolvency is just the state of that. The Y, remember, is to be or state of. Okay, to absolve, the idea of absolving someone from their sins, okay? That means loosening you away from your sins, okay? The ab means away, solve means to loosen. But now isn't this interesting? The word absolute is contrasted with relative, right? And the best example I could use for this is that, say, in archaeology, when you talk about relative dating versus absolute dating, what's going on here? Absolute means loosened away from any particular context. Dating in numbers and saying this is the continuum and this is the absolute, the exact number. You're using real numbers as opposed to relative, which has to do with relationship.